Tom Miller never expected that fixing a stranger's broken-down car would change his life forever. The mysterious black SUV that appeared outside his modest home the next morning seemed threatening at first, until a man in a crisp military uniform stepped out, holding an envelope that would turn Tom's entire world upside down. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the most extraordinary rewards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind whistled through the nearly empty parking lot of Miller's Auto Repair as Tom Miller wiped his grease-stained hands on an old rag, his eyes fixed on the clock above his workbench. It was already past closing time, and the setting sun cast long shadows through the garage's wide entrance. After 14 hours of nonstop work, his back ached, and all he could think about was getting home to his microwave dinner and comfortable recliner. Just as he reached for the main switch to power down the shop's lights, the distinct sound of a sputtering engine caught his attention. Tom's shoulders slumped. He knew that sound all too well. Someone's car was about to give up the ghost right in front of his shop. He debated pretending he hadn't heard it. After all, the closed sign had been hanging on the door for the past hour, and he'd already shut down the computer system for the day. The sputtering grew louder, followed by a loud pop and the screech of tires on asphalt. Tom sighed, running his calloused hands through his salt and pepper hair. 25 years of fixing cars had taught him one thing. That sound meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Despite his exhaustion, he found himself walking toward the entrance, tool belt still hanging heavy around his waist. An old Chevrolet came into view, its engine making sounds that would make any mechanic wince. Behind the wheel, Tom could make out the silhouette of someone frantically trying to restart the vehicle. As he approached, he noticed the driver was wearing what appeared to be a worn military jacket. The man inside was probably in his 70s, his weathered face etched with worry lines as he repeatedly turned the key in the ignition. "Need a hand there, sir?" Tom called out, approaching the driver's side window. The elderly man looked up, relief washing over his features. His hands, Tom noticed, were trembling slightly on the steering wheel. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet dignity Tom had often associated with veterans. "I saw your closed sign, but this old girl just decided to give up right here. I'm trying to get to my grandson's graduation ceremony." He gestured to a framed photograph on the passenger seat, a young man in a cap and gown. Tom glanced at his watch, then back at the hopeful eyes of the elderly veteran. The graduation ceremony the man mentioned was probably at Cedar Grove High School, about 20 miles down the road. If he didn't get this car running soon, this grandfather would miss one of the most important moments in his grandson's life. "Pop the hood for me," Tom said, already reaching for his flashlight. The familiar smell of burnt oil hit his nostrils as he lifted the hood, revealing an engine that had clearly seen better days. His trained eyes quickly spotted several issues: a blown head gasket, worn belts, and what looked like a failing alternator. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. The old veteran had stepped out of the car now, standing beside Tom with a worried expression. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight tremor. Tom noticed the man's posture, straight-backed despite his age, with a purple heart pin carefully attached to his jacket lapel. "It's not great," Tom admitted, "but let me see what I can do." He didn't have the heart to tell the man that these repairs would normally cost several $100s and take at least a day to complete. Instead, he dove into the engine compartment, his experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency. For the next hour, Tom worked steadily, using every trick he'd learned in his quarter-century of automotive repair. He bypassed the failing alternator, temporarily sealed the head gasket, and reinforced the worn belts. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would get the car running long enough for the man to attend his grandson's graduation. As Tom closed the hood and wiped his hands, the elderly veteran reached for his wallet. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, but Tom was already shaking his head. "Just make sure you get that alternator replaced soon," he said with a smile. "And tell your grandson congratulations from me." The veteran's eyes welled up with tears as he grasped Tom's hand in both of his. "Son, you don't know what this means to me. Richard, my grandson, he's the first in our family to graduate college. I couldn't bear to miss it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "My name's James Walker. If you ever need anything at all, you call this number." Tom tucked the card into his pocket without really looking at it, watching as the old Chevrolet, now running smoothly enough, disappeared into the gathering dusk. He finally locked up the shop, his dinner now cold and his recliner waiting. As he drove home, he couldn't help but smile, knowing he'd done the right thing, even if it meant working late. Little did Tom know that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would completely transform his life, starting with the mysterious black SUV that would be waiting outside his house the very next morning. The next morning dawned crisp and clear as Tom stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand, ready for another day at the shop. But the sight before him made him freeze mid-step, nearly spilling his coffee. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows sat parked directly across from his modest ranch-style house, its polished surface reflecting the early morning sun. Tom's first instinct was concern. In his quiet neighborhood, unfamiliar vehicles usually meant trouble. He'd heard about recent break-ins in the area, and this vehicle screamed, "Surveillance." As he stood there contemplating whether to call the local police, the SUV's rear door opened smoothly. A tall man in a pristine military dress uniform stepped out, his ribbons and medals catching the sunlight. He carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a high-ranking officer, and despite Tom's initial apprehension, there was something reassuring about his presence. The officer approached Tom's porch with measured steps, holding what appeared to be a leather portfolio under his arm. "Mr. Thomas Miller?" the officer called out, his voice carrying the same kind of quiet authority Tom had noticed in James Walker the night before. "I'm Colonel Robert Hayes. I apologize for the early morning visit, but I believe you helped a friend of mine last night. James Walker." Tom's tension eased slightly at the mention of the elderly veteran's name, though confusion still clouded his features. "Yes, sir. His car broke down outside my shop. I just helped him get to his grandson's graduation. Nothing special." The colonel's expression softened into a knowing smile. "Nothing special? Mr. Miller, you spent an hour of your own time after closing, performing several $100s worth of repairs, and then refused payment, all to help a stranger make it to his grandson's graduation. In my experience, that's quite special indeed." Tom shifted uncomfortably, unused to such praise. "Anyone would have done the same," he mumbled. But the colonel was already shaking his head. "No, Mr. Miller, they wouldn't have. And that's precisely why I'm here." He gestured toward the SUV. "Would you mind if we talked for a few minutes? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Tom glanced at his watch. He still had an hour before he needed to open the shop. "Sure," he replied, motioning toward the pair of weathered chairs on his porch. "Would you like some coffee, Colonel?" As they settled into the chairs, the colonel opened his leather portfolio, revealing several documents. "Mr. Miller, what you don't know is that James Walker isn't just any veteran. He's a highly decorated former Special Forces operator who served 3 tours in Vietnam. More importantly, he's now a senior advisor to the Veterans Affairs Committee, and he sits on the board of several military support organizations." Tom's eyebrows rose in surprise. The humble elderly man from last night had given no indication of such an important position. "I had no idea," he admitted. "He just seemed like a grandfather trying to make it to his grandson's graduation." "That's exactly why I'm here," the colonel continued. "James was deeply moved by your kindness, particularly because you had no idea who he was. He made some calls last night, and that's where things get interesting." He pulled out a photograph from his portfolio. It showed a massive warehouse-style building with multiple garage bays. "This is the Central Military Vehicle Maintenance Facility in Fort Carson," the colonel explained. "We're implementing a new civilian partnership program, and we're looking for experienced mechanics who understand both the technical aspects of vehicle maintenance and the importance of service to others. James thinks you might be perfect for this opportunity." Tom stared at the photograph, his mind racing with possibilities. The facility looked state-of-the-art, nothing like his small local shop. "I'm honored, sir, but I'm just a regular mechanic. I don't have any military experience." The colonel's eyes crinkled with amusement. "What you showed last night, that dedication to helping others, that willingness to go above and beyond, that's exactly what we're looking for. Sometimes the best way to serve isn't always in uniform. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Tom found himself leaning forward in his chair, hanging on every word as the colonel began to outline an opportunity that would change everything. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would test his skills, challenge his limits, and reveal the true power of one simple act of kindness. The colonel pulled out more documents, spreading them carefully on the small porch table between them. The position comes with significant benefits, Mr. Miller. Full medical coverage, retirement plan, and a salary that's considerably higher than what most private shops can offer. But more importantly, you'd be working on vehicles that serve our troops. Everything from standard transport vehicles to specialized equipment. Tom's coffee had grown cold in his hands as he absorbed the information. The opportunity seemed almost too good to be true. He thought about his small shop, the struggle to keep up with rising costs, and the increasingly complex systems in modern vehicles that required expensive diagnostic equipment he could barely afford. What exactly would my role be? Tom asked, his professional curiosity piqued. The colonel handed him another photograph, this one showing a team of mechanics working on what appeared to be a heavily modified Humvee. You'd start as a senior civilian mechanical specialist, the colonel explained. Your experience with quick, creative solutions, like what you did for James last night, is exactly what we need. Our vehicles often need to be serviced in less than ideal conditions, and having someone who can think on their feet is invaluable. The morning traffic was picking up on Tom's quiet street, a reminder that the workday was approaching. But for the first time in years, Tom wasn't rushing to open his shop. Something about this opportunity had captured his full attention. There's one more thing, the colonel added, pulling out a final document. We've been reviewing your background, Mr. Miller. We know about the youth mentorship program you ran at the community college 5 years ago, teaching basic auto maintenance to at-risk teens. That program had a significant impact. Several of those young people went on to successful careers in automotive repair. Tom was surprised. He hadn't thought about that program in years. It had been a volunteer position, something he'd done on weekends because he believed in giving kids a chance to learn a trade. How did you know about that? The colonel smiled. We do our homework, Mr. Miller. That's why we're confident you're the right person for this position. In addition to your mechanical duties, we'd want you to help establish a training program for veterans transitioning to civilian life. Your experience both as a mechanic and a mentor would be invaluable. A police cruiser drove by slowly, Officer Martinez doing his morning patrol. He waved at Tom, then did a double take at the sight of the black SUV and the uniformed colonel. Tom waved back, his mind already racing with possibilities. Teaching veterans, working on military vehicles, being part of something bigger than himself. It was more than just a job offer. It was an opportunity to make a real difference. I'll need some time to think about it, Tom said finally, his voice thoughtful. The colonel nodded, gathering his documents back into the portfolio. Of course, take the weekend to consider it. But remember, Mr. Miller, opportunities like this are rare. Sometimes the biggest doors in life open because we helped someone else through a smaller one. He stood, straightening his uniform. We'll be in touch on Monday for your decision. As the colonel walked back to the SUV, Tom remained in his porch chair, the cold coffee forgotten in his hands. He watched as the vehicle pulled away smoothly, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. His quiet life had just been turned upside down, all because he'd decided to help an elderly veteran make it to his grandson's graduation. He couldn't help but wonder what other surprises lay ahead. The weekend passed in a blur as Tom wrestled with the colonel's unexpected offer. His small auto shop, usually a source of comfort with its familiar smells of oil and metal, now felt different somehow, as if its walls held both memories and limitations he'd never noticed before. By Monday morning, he had barely slept, his mind running through endless scenarios and possibilities. He was elbow-deep in a transmission repair when his phone buzzed in his pocket. The number was unfamiliar, but something made him wipe his hands and answer it anyway. "Miller's Auto Repair," he answered, trying to sound more awake than he felt. "Mr. Miller, this is James Walker." The voice on the other end was warm and familiar. "I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to thank you again for your help the other night. Richard's graduation was wonderful. But I also wanted to talk to you about Colonel Hayes's visit." Tom leaned against his workbench, absently fiddling with a wrench. "Sir, I have to admit, I wasn't expecting any of this. A military contract position? Training programs? It's a lot to take in." James chuckled softly. "I understand. But there's something else you should know. Would you be willing to meet me for lunch? There are some things better discussed in person." An hour later, Tom found himself pulling into the parking lot of Veterans Memorial Park, a peaceful stretch of green space on the outskirts of town. James Walker was already there, sitting at a picnic table near the memorial wall, 2 paper bags from the local deli beside him. As Tom approached, he noticed James wasn't alone. A group of men and women, varying in age but all carrying themselves with military bearing, stood nearby, engaged in quiet conversation. They nodded respectfully as Tom passed. "Hope you like pastrami," James said, pushing one of the bags toward Tom. "Sit down, son. There's something I need to show you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old, worn photograph. It showed a much younger James, standing next to a military vehicle in what appeared to be a jungle setting. "Vietnam, 1969, James explained, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Our unit had been on a critical mission when our transport broke down. We were stuck in hostile territory, radio barely working, and our mechanic had been wounded in an earlier engagement. Things looked pretty grim." He paused, taking a bite of his sandwich, his eyes focused on the distant memorial wall. But there was this civilian contractor, a mechanic named Frank Peterson. He was supposed to be heading home that day. His tour was over. Instead, when he heard about our situation, he volunteered to come out with the rescue team. Spent 6 hours fixing our vehicle under the most dangerous conditions imaginable, saved our entire unit. Tom listened intently, beginning to understand why his simple act of kindness had resonated so deeply with James. The elderly veteran continued, "Frank didn't have to help us. He could have gone home. But he understood something that I see in you, that sometimes the ability to fix things, to keep things running, that's not just a job, it's a calling." The group nearby had grown quiet, listening to James's story. One of them, a woman with captain's bars on her uniform, stepped forward. "Mr. Miller, I'm Captain Sarah Rodriguez. I oversee vehicle maintenance training at Fort Carson. What Mr. Walker and Colonel Hayes are proposing isn't just about fixing military vehicles. It's about building a bridge between civilian expertise and military needs." James nodded, pulling out more photographs, these more recent, showing modern military vehicles and maintenance facilities. "The program we're developing isn't just about maintenance. It's about creating a support system for our military personnel and veterans. Your experience, your teaching background, your approach to problem solving, these are exactly what we need." Tom unwrapped his sandwich but didn't eat, his attention captured by the scope of what was being proposed. "But why me? Surely there are more qualified people." "Because you showed integrity without knowing who I was," James interrupted. "Because you didn't just fix my car. You listened, you cared, and you went above and beyond. That's not something you can teach. That's character." Captain Rodriguez sat down at the table, adding her voice to the conversation. "The position we're offering would involve not just mechanical work, but also developing training programs for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. Your experience running that youth mentorship program showed us you understand the importance of passing on knowledge." The autumn breeze rustled through the park's trees as Tom absorbed their words. The memorial wall stood as a silent reminder of service and sacrifice, making his own concerns about leaving his comfortable routine seem small in comparison. "There's one more thing," James said, pulling out a final document. "The salary Colonel Hayes mentioned? That was just the starting point. We've secured additional funding for the training program development. This position comes with full benefits, retirement plan, and..." He slid the paper across the table. "This compensation package." Tom's eyes widened as he saw the figure. It was more than triple what he currently made at his shop. But somehow, the money seemed secondary to the opportunity being presented. The chance to be part of something larger than himself, to make a real difference in people's lives. As the group around them dispersed, leaving Tom alone with James and Captain Rodriguez, he found himself looking at his own reflection in the polished surface of the memorial wall. His father had always told him that opportunities come disguised as ordinary moments. Now, sitting in this park, surrounded by the echoes of service and sacrifice, he understood exactly what that meant. The following days blurred together as Tom found himself diving deeper into the opportunity before him. After that meaningful conversation in Veterans Memorial Park, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change dramatically. Captain Rodriguez had left him with a thick folder of information about the Fort Carson facility, and he spent his evenings poring over the details, imagining himself in this new role. Thursday morning brought another surprise. Tom was just opening his shop when a convoy of 3 military vehicles pulled into his parking lot. His first thought was that they were lost, but then he recognized Captain Rodriguez stepping out of the lead vehicle, accompanied by 2 mechanics in military uniforms. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she called out, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Hope you don't mind an impromptu visit. We thought you might like to get your hands dirty with some actual military equipment before making your decision." Tom's eyes were drawn to the vehicles. They weren't standard military issue. These were specialized maintenance vehicles, equipped with mobile repair stations and diagnostic equipment he'd only read about in trade magazines. The kind of equipment that could make any mechanic's heart race. "These are our mobile repair units," Captain Rodriguez explained, leading him to the nearest vehicle. "We use them for field maintenance and training. Today we've got a few technical challenges we'd like your help with, if you're interested." Tom didn't hesitate. "Let me grab my tools," he said, already heading back to his workbench. He returned to find the 2 military mechanics, Sergeant Chen and Specialist Martinez, had opened up the hood of one of the vehicles. "We've been having intermittent issues with the auxiliary power system," Sergeant Chen explained, pointing to a complex array of electronics. "It stumped our regular maintenance crew for weeks. Thought maybe a fresh pair of eyes might help." For the next several hours, Tom found himself completely absorbed in the challenge. The system was unlike anything he'd worked on before, combining traditional mechanical elements with advanced military-grade electronics. He worked alongside Chen and Martinez, trading ideas and techniques, learning as much as he taught. What struck him most was the collaborative atmosphere. In his own shop, he usually worked alone, but here, there was a constant exchange of knowledge. When he suggested a novel approach to diagnosing the power issue, both military mechanics listened intently, offering their own insights to refine the solution. "That's impressive," Captain Rodriguez commented, watching as Tom used a modified diagnostic technique he'd developed for hybrid vehicles to trace the problem to a hidden sensor malfunction. Most mechanics would have replaced half the system by now. Tom wiped his hands on a rag, feeling a sense of satisfaction as the auxiliary power unit hummed to life perfectly. "Sometimes the simplest solution is hidden behind the most complex problem," he said, remembering how many times that philosophy had served him well over the years. As they broke for lunch, Captain Rodriguez had brought sandwiches from the same deli where he'd met with James. The conversation turned to the training aspects of the position. "We've got a lot of veterans with mechanical aptitude," Martinez explained, "but transitioning from military to civilian work can be challenging. Having someone who understands both worlds would make a huge difference." Tom thought about his youth mentorship program, how rewarding it had been to watch his students grow and succeed. "What kind of curriculum are you envisioning?" he asked, his mind already forming ideas. Captain Rodriguez pulled out a tablet, showing him preliminary plans for the training facility. "That's where you'd come in. We have the basics outlined, but we need someone with real-world experience to develop it into something practical and effective." The afternoon brought more challenges. Each vehicle had its own unique issues to solve. Tom found himself increasingly impressed by the sophistication of the equipment and the dedication of the military mechanics. By the time the sun began to set, He had helped resolve 3 different mechanical issues and learned more about military vehicles than he'd thought possible in a single day. As the team prepared to leave, Captain Rodriguez handed him one final document. "This is the official offer, Mr. Miller. Take the weekend to think it over, but we'd need your answer by Monday. This program is ready to launch, and we need someone who can hit the ground running." Tom watched as the convoy pulled away, his mind racing with possibilities. The day had shown him exactly what he'd be getting into: the challenges, the opportunities, the chance to make a real difference. His small shop suddenly felt different, like a comfortable old coat he'd outgrown. Later that night, as he sat in his favorite chair reviewing the offer letter, his eyes kept coming back to one particular phrase: "Position to commence immediately upon acceptance." The thought should have terrified him, leaving his established business, stepping into an entirely new world. Instead, he felt a growing sense of excitement. His father's old toolbox sat in the corner, the one he'd inherited when he first started in this business. Inside was a worn photograph of his dad teaching him how to change his first tire. "Sometimes, son," his father had said, "the best opportunities are the ones that scare you a little." Looking around his living room, at the life he'd built for himself, Tom realized that everything, his years of experience, his teaching background, even his habit of helping strangers, had been preparing him for this moment. The question wasn't whether he was ready for this change. The question was whether he was ready to admit that he'd been waiting for something like this all along. Monday morning arrived with a clarity Tom hadn't expected. After a weekend of intense reflection, he'd made his decision. He pulled into the parking lot of his shop earlier than usual, the familiar crunch of gravel under his tires now carrying a different weight. The Miller's Auto Repair sign, faded from years of sun exposure, seemed to echo with 2 decades of memories. Inside, he began his usual morning routine, starting the coffee maker, checking his appointment book, organizing his tools. But today, each action felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. His phone showed 7:30 a.m. when he finally dialed the number Captain Rodriguez had left him. "Mr. Miller," she answered on the second ring, as if she'd been expecting his call. "I hope you've had enough time to consider our offer." Her tone was professional, but carried a hint of anticipation. "I have," Tom replied, his voice steady. "I'd like to accept the position." The words felt both terrifying and liberating as they left his mouth. "But I'll need some time to properly close down my shop and take care of my current customers." "Of course," Captain Rodriguez responded, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "We can work with that. How about we schedule a formal meeting to discuss the transition? Colonel Hayes would like to be present as well." 3 hours later, Tom found himself driving through the imposing gates of Fort Carson. The base was massive, a city unto itself, with buildings and facilities stretching as far as he could see. A young corporal escorted him to a modern office building where Colonel Hayes and Captain Rodriguez were waiting. The colonel's office was spartanly furnished but impressive, with large windows overlooking the base's main parade ground. "Mr. Miller," he greeted, standing to shake Tom's hand. "Welcome aboard. I trust you've had time to process everything." "Yes, sir," Tom replied, taking a seat across from the colonel's desk. "I've already started making arrangements for my current customers. I know a few reliable shops I can refer them to." Captain Rodriguez opened a laptop, pulling up a detailed timeline. "We've drafted a transition plan," she explained. "We understand you'll need about a month to properly close your business. During that time, we'd like you to start spending some afternoons here, familiarizing yourself with our facilities and beginning work on the training program outline." The next 2 hours were filled with details: paperwork, security clearances, facility access protocols. Tom's head was spinning with information, but underneath it all was a growing sense of excitement. The colonel showed him architectural plans for a new training facility being built specifically for the veteran program. "This is where you'll be making the biggest impact," Colonel Hayes explained, pointing to a large workshop area in the plans. "We're designing it to bridge the gap between military and civilian vehicle maintenance. Your experience in both worlds will be invaluable." As they walked through the current facility, Tom was introduced to various team members. Each person they met seemed genuinely excited about the new program. Master Sergeant Thompson, a gruff veteran with 30 years of service, showed particular enthusiasm. "Been waiting years for something like this," Thompson said, walking Tom through their current maintenance bay. "These young veterans, they have the skills, the discipline. They just need someone who can help them translate that to civilian work." The tour ended at what would be Tom's office, a corner space overlooking both the maintenance facility and the training areas. It was bigger than anything he'd had at his shop, with room for both administrative work and hands-on instruction. "There's one more thing," Captain Rodriguez said, handing him a security badge. "This is temporary until your permanent credentials arrive, but it means you can start coming in for orientation whenever you're ready." As Tom drove home that evening, his mind was already racing with plans. He thought about his current customers, loyal people who'd trusted him with their vehicles for years. He'd need to handle the transition carefully, ensure they were taken care of. But mixed with that concern was an undeniable excitement about what lay ahead. His phone buzzed with a text from James Walker. "Heard the good news. You've made the right choice, son. This is just the beginning." Looking in his rearview mirror, Tom could see Fort Carson growing smaller behind him. In less than a month, he'd be driving in the opposite direction, heading toward rather than away from those gates. The thought should have been overwhelming, but instead it felt right. His small shop had been his life for so long, but now it felt like a chapter coming to a natural close. Ahead lay something bigger, a chance to not just fix vehicles, but to help fix lives, to be part of something that mattered on a larger scale. As he pulled into his driveway, the setting sun casting long shadows across his front yard, Tom remembered something his father used to say. "A good mechanic doesn't just fix what's broken, he makes sure it runs better than before." Maybe that's what this opportunity was really about. Not just fixing things, but making them better, on a scale he'd never imagined possible. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Tom balanced closing down his shop with preparing for his new role. Each day brought new challenges and revelations, forcing him to navigate between his old life and the promising future ahead. The process of winding down 20 years of business proved more emotional than he'd expected. Early Monday morning, he stood in his shop, surrounded by the familiar tools and equipment he'd accumulated over the years. Some would go with him to Fort Carson, others would be sold or given away. Each item seemed to hold a memory: the specialized wrench set his father had given him when he first opened the shop, the diagnostic computer he'd saved months to buy, the worn leather chair where countless customers had sat sharing their stories. "You're really doing it, huh?" The voice belonged to Mike Hansen, owner of the parts store down the street and Tom's friend for the past 15 years. He stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee, their morning ritual for as long as either could remember. "Yeah," Tom replied, accepting the coffee. "Starting to feel real now." He gestured to the closing sales sign he'd put up in the window, advertising tools and equipment at discount prices. "Never thought I'd be doing this." Mike nodded thoughtfully, looking around the shop. "Military contract, training veterans. It's a big step up, Tom. We're all proud of you, even if we'll miss having you around." The morning brought a steady stream of longtime customers, each reacting differently to the news of the shop's closing. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been bringing her family's vehicles to Tom for 15 years, actually teared up when he gave her a list of recommended mechanics. "But none of them are you, Tom," she said, clutching the paper. "Who's going to explain everything so I understand? Who's going to look out for us like you do?" Her words struck a chord. Tom had spent years building trust with his customers, treating them like family. It wasn't just about fixing cars, it was about taking care of people. Now he understood why the military program had resonated with him so deeply. It was a chance to extend that same care to a whole new community. By afternoon, he was at Fort Carson for his orientation sessions. The contrast between his old shop and the military facility was stark. Instead of working alone, he was now part of a team. The maintenance bay buzzed with activity, mechanics in uniform working on everything from Humvees to specialized communications vehicles. "Today we're starting you on systems familiarization," Sergeant Chen explained, leading Tom to a partially disassembled engine. "This is from an MATV, Mine Resistant Ambush Protected All-Terrain Vehicle, Different beast from what you're used to. For the next several hours, Tom immersed himself in learning the intricacies of military vehicles. The basic principles were familiar, but the applications were entirely different. These weren't family cars needing oil changes. These were complex machines designed to protect lives in combat situations. "You're catching on quick," Chen commented, watching Tom correctly diagnose a transmission issue. "Most civilians take weeks to get comfortable with these systems." Later, in a meeting with Captain Rodriguez, Tom presented his initial ideas for the veteran training program. He'd spent evenings sketching out plans, drawing from both his experience teaching youth and his years in the industry. "I'm thinking we start with the basics," he explained, spreading his notes across the conference table. "Not just the technical skills, they already have those, but the business side. Customer service, shop management, dealing with civilian expectations, things they might not have learned in the military." Captain Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what we need. These veterans have incredible technical skills, but transitioning to civilian work is about more than just turning wrenches." As the day wound down, Tom returned to his shop for one last evening of work. The space felt different now, like a well-worn book he was preparing to close. He'd already started packing his tools, each one carefully wrapped and labeled for its new home at Fort Carson. Jim Parker, his oldest customer, stopped by just before closing. The elderly man had been bringing his cars to Tom since the shop opened. "Heard you were leaving us," he said, leaning against the workbench. "Military's lucky to have you." Tom smiled, remembering all the times he'd worked on Jim's old Chevrolet. "It's not goodbye forever. I'll still be in town, just wearing a different hat." "Different hat, same heart," Jim replied sagely. "You know, Tom, some people fix things because it's their job. You fix things because it's who you are. Those veterans, they're getting more than just a mechanic." As the sun set, casting long shadows through the garage doors, Tom looked around his shop one last time. The walls held 2 decades of memories, but ahead lay a future full of promise. He wasn't just closing a chapter. He was beginning a new one, taking everything he'd learned and using it to make a different kind of impact. His phone buzzed. A message from Colonel Hayes about tomorrow's orientation schedule. The new beginning was rushing toward him like an incoming tide, and for the first time in weeks, Tom felt completely ready for it. Sometimes the best way to honor the past was to use it as a foundation for the future. The morning of Tom's first official day at Fort Carson dawned clear and crisp. He'd spent the weekend moving the last of his equipment from his old shop, and now his personal tools occupied a designated space in the military facility's vast maintenance bay. Standing in his new uniform, khaki work clothes with his name and position embroidered in military precision, he felt both nervous and excited. Captain Rodriguez met him at the entrance, accompanied by a group he hadn't seen before. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. Ready to meet your first class?" She gestured to the 8 people standing behind her, men and women of various ages, all wearing civilian clothes but carrying themselves with unmistakable military bearing. "These are your pilot group participants," she explained. "All veterans transitioning to civilian mechanical work. They'll be helping us refine the program before we roll it out on a larger scale." Tom looked at the group, taking in their mixed expressions of hope and uncertainty, emotions he understood all too well after his own recent transition. "Welcome, everyone," he said, moving forward to shake each person's hand. "I'm Tom Miller, and I'm here to help bridge the gap between military and civilian mechanical work." The group included Sarah Martinez, a former helicopter mechanic, James Chen, who'd worked on tanks in Afghanistan, Mike Thompson, a retired Marine Corps vehicle specialist, and 5 others, each bringing unique military mechanical experience to the table. "First thing we need to do," Tom announced, leading them into the maintenance bay, "is understand that while the principles are the same, the context is different. In civilian work, it's not just about fixing the vehicle, it's about working with the customer." He walked them to a row of vehicles, a mix of civilian cars and military vehicles. "We'll be working on both types. You already know the military side better than I do. I'm here to help you adapt those skills to civilian work." The day unfolded in a series of practical exercises. Tom had designed scenarios that combined technical challenges with customer service situations. He watched as his students tackled complex repairs while role-playing interactions with civilian customers. "Remember," he advised, watching Sarah Martinez diagnose a transmission problem, "civilian customers don't understand military precision and terminology. You need to translate your knowledge into language they can understand and trust." During lunch break, Tom sat with his students in the facility's break room, listening to their stories and concerns. Mike Thompson spoke for many when he admitted, "It's not the mechanical work that worries me. It's dealing with civilian expectations. In the military, you follow protocols. Out there, every customer has different demands." Tom nodded understandingly. "That's exactly why we're here. You already have the hard skills, probably better than most civilian mechanics. What we're going to develop is the soft skills, the business understanding, the customer rapport." In the afternoon, Colonel Hayes stopped by to observe the training. Tom was demonstrating how to handle a difficult customer situation when he noticed the colonel watching with approval. The scenario involved a complex repair that needed to be explained to a budget-conscious customer, a common situation in civilian work. "See how you need to balance technical accuracy with customer understanding," Tom explained to his class. "In the military, you report problems and solutions directly. In civilian work, you need to help customers make informed decisions about their vehicles and their money." As the day progressed, Tom noticed something remarkable happening. His students were already beginning to adapt, blending their military precision with a more civilian-friendly approach. During one exercise, James Chen perfectly explained a complex engine problem to a mock customer without using a single military term. "That's exactly right," Tom praised. "You maintained your technical expertise while making it accessible. That's what will set you apart in civilian work." Near the end of the day, Captain Rodriguez returned with more news. "The word's getting out about this program," she announced. "We've already got a waiting list of veterans interested in joining. Mr. Miller, your approach is exactly what we were hoping for." As Tom watched his students pack up for the day, each one looking more confident than they had that morning, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was more than just teaching mechanics. It was helping fellow professionals find their place in a new world. Later, alone in his office, Tom reviewed his notes from the day. On his desk sat a framed photo of his old shop, a reminder of where he'd come from. Next to it was a new picture, his first class of veterans, taken that morning. Two worlds, connected by skill, dedication, and the desire to help others. His phone buzzed with a message from James Walker. "Heard great things about your first day. This is exactly why we chose you." Tom smiled, remembering the night he'd helped the elderly veteran with his car. That simple act of kindness had led to all of this. Looking out his office window at the setting sun casting long shadows across the maintenance yard, Tom felt a profound sense of rightness. He was no longer just fixing cars. He was helping fix lives, building bridges between military precision and civilian needs, creating pathways for veterans to succeed in their next chapter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, Tom Miller, former small-town mechanic turned military training specialist, knew he was exactly where he needed to be. Sometimes the best rewards come not from what you gain, but from what you give to others. As weeks turned into months, Tom's program at Fort Carson evolved beyond anyone's initial expectations. What had started as a small pilot project was quickly gaining recognition across military branches. One particular Wednesday morning, he arrived to find Colonel Hayes and Captain Rodriguez waiting in his office, accompanied by two high-ranking officers he didn't recognize. "Mr. Miller," Colonel Hayes began, his expression unusually animated, "I'd like you to meet General Matthews from the Pentagon and Admiral Crawford from the Navy's Technical Training Command. They've been hearing about our success here and wanted to see firsthand what we're doing." Tom straightened, suddenly aware of the magnitude of the moment. The general stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Miller, your program's results have caught our attention. You've achieved an impressive 98% civilian employment rate for your graduates. We'd like to understand how." "It's really about understanding both worlds, sir," Tom replied, leading the group toward the maintenance bay where his current class was working. These veterans already have exceptional technical skills. What they need is someone who can help them translate those skills to civilian applications. The bay was alive with activity. 20 veterans, twice the size of his initial class, were engaged in various training scenarios. Some worked on military vehicles, others on civilian cars, learning to switch between the two contexts seamlessly. "Watch this," Tom said, pointing to a former Army mechanic named Rodriguez working with a civilian customer, actually a role-playing volunteer. Rodriguez was explaining a complex transmission problem in clear, relatable terms, a far cry from the technical military jargon he'd used when he first started. "We're not just teaching mechanics," Tom explained to the observers. "We're teaching communication, business management, customer service, everything they need to succeed in the civilian sector. Many of our graduates have gone on to open their own shops." Admiral Crawford nodded approvingly. "And you've implemented this same program model across different military specialties, not just vehicle maintenance?" "Yes, sir," Captain Rodriguez interjected. "Mr. Miller's methodology has been adapted for aviation mechanics, electronic system specialists, even heavy equipment operators. The principles remain the same, building bridges between military expertise and civilian applications." They watched as another student, Sarah Chen, handled a challenging customer situation. The role-playing civilian was being difficult, demanding unnecessary repairs. Sarah calmly explained the actual problems, providing documentation and clear explanations, skills she'd learned in Tom's program. "The key," Tom continued, "is helping them understand that their military training is an asset, not a barrier. They already know how to maintain vehicles under the most demanding conditions. We just help them adapt that knowledge to civilian expectations." General Matthews studied a nearby workstation, where veterans were learning to use civilian diagnostic equipment. "And you developed this curriculum yourself, Mr. Miller?" "Yes, sir. Drew from my 20 years of civilian experience, combined with what I learned about military procedures. Each lesson plan integrates both perspectives." Tom pulled out a tablet, showing them the comprehensive training materials he'd developed. Later that afternoon, after the high-ranking visitors had departed, Colonel Hayes called Tom back to his office. "They were impressed, Tom, very impressed. They're talking about implementing your program model across all major military installations." Tom sat down, the weight of this news settling in. "That would mean thousands of veterans getting this training. We'd need to scale up significantly, train more instructors." "Exactly," the colonel smiled. "And they want you to oversee it all. They're creating a new position, Director of Veteran Technical Training Integration. The role would involve traveling to different bases, training instructors, implementing your program nationwide." Tom's mind raced with the possibilities. His simple desire to help veterans transition to civilian work had grown into something far bigger than he'd ever imagined. He thought about his first class, now all successfully employed or running their own businesses. "There's more," Captain Rodriguez added, entering the office. "Remember that youth mentorship program you used to run? They want to integrate something similar, having our veteran trainees mentor young people interested in mechanical careers. Full circle, so to speak." The sun was setting by the time Tom left the office that evening. Walking through the maintenance bay, now quiet after the day's activities, he paused to look at the photos on the wall. 3 classes of graduates, all now successful in civilian careers. His phone buzzed with a message from James Walker. "Heard about the Pentagon visit. From helping an old man make it to his grandson's graduation to changing thousands of lives. Proud of you, son." Tom smiled, remembering that night that had started it all. He'd just been doing what he thought was right, helping someone in need. Now that simple act had grown into something that would impact veterans across the country. As he reached his car, he saw one of his current students, Mike Foster, still working on a complex engine problem. The former Marine had stayed late, determined to master the civilian diagnostic system. That kind of dedication, Tom thought, was what made this program special. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, planning for nationwide implementation, developing training materials for other bases, selecting and preparing instructors. But tonight, watching Mike's dedication, Tom knew that every challenge would be worth it. Sometimes the greatest journeys start with the smallest steps, and the greatest rewards come from helping others find their path. The next several months transformed Tom's life in ways he never could have imagined. As the new director of Veteran Technical Training Integration, he found himself traveling across the country, setting up programs at different military bases. Today, he was back at Fort Carson, preparing for a special ceremony that would mark a significant milestone in the program's history. The maintenance bay, usually filled with the sounds of tools and engines, had been transformed. Rows of chairs faced a small stage, and banners celebrating a 100th graduating class hung from the ceiling. For Tom, it was a moment of profound significance, not just because of the numbers, but because of what they represented. "Hard to believe it all started with fixing my car," a familiar voice said behind him. Tom turned to find James Walker, now walking with a cane but still carrying himself with military bearing. "I knew that night that you were something special, son." Before Tom could respond, Captain Rodriguez, now Major Rodriguez, approached with an urgent update. "Mr. Miller, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs just confirmed. He'll be attending today's ceremony, and there's something else you should know." She handed him a folder marked "Confidential." Inside was a presidential citation, recognizing the program's impact on veteran employment and economic development. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he read the document. The program had placed over 10,000 veterans in successful civilian careers, with another 15,000 currently in training nationwide. "Your little act of kindness has created quite a ripple effect," Colonel Hayes commented, joining them. He'd been there from the beginning, supporting and guiding the program's growth. "But that's not all we're celebrating today." The colonel led Tom to a side room where several familiar faces waited, graduates from his first class. Sarah Martinez now owned 3 successful auto repair shops in Colorado. James Chen had become a lead instructor at the Fort Bragg program. Mike Thompson was running a vocational school for at-risk youth. "We wanted to surprise you," Sarah said, stepping forward. "We've established a scholarship fund in your name, the Tom Miller Veteran Technical Training Foundation. It's going to help veterans who need additional support during their transition." Tom felt overwhelmed by the gesture. "I don't know what to say. I just wanted to help people find their way, like I did that night with Mr. Walker's car." The ceremony itself was more grand than Tom had ever expected. The maintenance bay was packed with military personnel, program graduates, and dignitaries. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs spoke about the program's national impact, citing statistics that showed dramatically improved employment rates for veteran participants. But it was the personal stories that touched Tom the most. One by one, graduates came forward to share how the program had changed their lives. A former tank mechanic who now ran a successful fleet maintenance company, a helicopter technician who developed a specialized training program for aviation mechanics. Each success story traced back to that one night when Tom had chosen to help a stranded veteran. During his own speech, Tom found himself thinking about his old shop. "I spent 20 years fixing cars," he told the audience, "but what I discovered here was that sometimes the most important things we fix aren't mechanical at all. We're fixing transitions, bridging gaps, rebuilding confidence." He spoke about the program's future, new initiatives being developed, partnerships with civilian companies, expanded opportunities for veterans. But more importantly, he spoke about the ripple effect of kindness, how one small action could spark a chain reaction of positive change. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and celebrated, Tom found a quiet moment with James Walker. The elderly veteran's eyes were moist with emotion. "You know, Tom, when my car broke down that night, I was worried I'd miss my grandson's graduation. Instead, I witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary." "Richard's doing well, by the way," James continued, pulling out his phone to show a photo. "He's joining the program as an instructor next month, says he wants to give back, just like you did." Later that evening, as the maintenance bay returned to its usual state, Tom walked through the familiar space. The walls were now lined with photos of graduating classes, success stories, and newspaper articles about the program. Each image represented a life changed, a dream realized, a future secured. His phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from program graduates across the country. Each one had a story. Each one had taken what they'd learned and used it to help others. The ripple effect continued to grow. Colonel Hayes found him there, looking at the photos. "You know, Tom, when we first offered you this position, we thought we were getting a skilled mechanic who could teach veterans. Instead, we got someone who understood that the biggest repairs sometimes involve fixing people's faith in themselves." Tom nodded, thinking about how far they'd come. It's amazing what can happen when you give people the tools they need to rebuild their lives. As he prepared to leave for the day, Tom paused at his office door. On his desk sat the original business card James Walker had given him that first night, now framed alongside the presidential citation. Two simple pieces of paper that bookended an extraordinary journey. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest achievements don't come from grand plans or calculated strategies. They come from simple moments of kindness, from choosing to help when you could just as easily walk away. And in those moments, lives aren't just changed. They're transformed in ways that ripple out to touch countless others. 1 year after the milestone ceremony, Tom found himself standing in front of an even larger audience. The Pentagon had organized a special recognition event, not just for the program's continued success, but for a groundbreaking new initiative that had emerged from it. The maintenance bay where it all started had become too small for such gatherings. They were now in a vast auditorium at the military's largest technical training facility. "Today marks the beginning of something extraordinary," Tom began his address, looking out at the sea of faces. "We're not just celebrating success, we're launching the future." Behind him, a large screen displayed the blueprint for what would become the National Veterans Technical Training Center, a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to helping veterans transition into civilian careers. The project had grown far beyond vehicle maintenance. The new center would offer training in multiple technical fields, from advanced electronics to aerospace technology. Tom's original program had become the model for a comprehensive approach to veteran career transition. "Mr. Miller," General Matthews stepped forward, "would you like to share the numbers with our audience?" Tom nodded, turning to the latest statistics displayed on the screen. Over 25,000 veterans had completed the program, with a 97% employment rate. The ripple effect had created over 50,000 jobs, including positions for other veterans and civilian workers. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. Tom invited Sarah Martinez to the stage, one of his first students, now a key figure in the program's expansion. "When I first met Mr. Miller," she began, "I was a helicopter mechanic who couldn't imagine working in the civilian world. Today, I own 5 successful auto repair shops, and I've hired over 30 veterans through this program." The audience listened intently as Sarah described the program's evolution. What had started as basic mechanical training had grown to include business management, leadership development, and mentorship opportunities. Veterans weren't just learning trades, they were building careers and creating opportunities for others. James Walker, now in a wheelchair but still sharp as ever, sat in the front row. Tom acknowledged him specially, reminding everyone how a broken-down car and an act of kindness had sparked this movement. "Mr. Walker taught me something important that night," Tom reflected. "Sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest impact." After the main presentation, Tom led a tour of the site where the new training center would be built. The facility would span 50 acres, featuring cutting-edge workshops, classrooms, and even housing for veterans during their training. Major corporations had pledged support, recognizing the value of well-trained veteran employees. "The best part," Tom explained to the group of officials and reporters, "is that every graduate becomes part of our mentorship network. They're not just finding their own path, they're helping others find theirs." The program had created a self-sustaining community of support and opportunity. During the tour, a young veteran approached Tom. "Sir," she said, "I just completed the program last month. Yesterday, I signed the lease on my own repair shop. I never thought I'd own a business, but you showed me it was possible." These moments still touched Tom deeply. Every success story reminded him of his own journey, from small-town mechanic to national program director. But more importantly, each story represented a life transformed, a future secured, a dream realized. Later that evening, At a small gathering of program staff and supporters, Colonel Hayes raised a toast. "To Tom Miller," he said, "who showed us that the best way to help veterans isn't just to train them, it's to believe in them." Tom used the moment to announce another expansion of the program. "We're launching a scholarship program for veterans' children," he revealed, "because we're not just changing lives today, we're investing in the future." The initiative would provide technical training opportunities for the next generation, creating a legacy of skilled professionals and entrepreneurs. It was another way the program's impact would continue to grow and evolve. As the evening wound down, Tom found himself back in his office at Fort Carson. The walls were covered with photos and letters from graduates, each one a reminder of the program's real impact. His old toolbox sat in the corner, a humble reminder of where it all began. James Walker's grandson Richard, now a senior instructor in the program, stopped by. "You know what's amazing?" he said, looking at the photos. "Every person on these walls has their own story of helping others now. The kindness you showed my grandfather that night just keeps multiplying." Tom nodded, thinking about the future. The new training center would open its doors in 18 months. Thousands more veterans would find their path to success. But more importantly, each one would carry forward the lesson he'd learned that night on a quiet street, that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the belief in their potential. As he prepared to leave for the day, Tom paused to look out at the setting sun. The maintenance bay where it all started was visible from his window, still busy with activity even at this hour. In the distance, construction equipment stood ready to break ground on the new training center. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important repairs aren't made with wrenches and tools. They're made with kindness, understanding, and the willingness to help others find their way. And sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes, changes that continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways we never could have imagined. 5 years had passed since the National Veterans Technical Training Center opened its doors, and Tom Miller stood in his office, preparing for what would be the most significant announcement in the program's history. The view from his window had changed dramatically. Where once there was a simple maintenance bay, now stood a sprawling campus that had become a beacon of hope for veterans nationwide. Today's press conference would reveal something even bigger. After years of success in the United States, the program was going international. Military organizations from across the globe had taken notice, and now Tom's model would help veterans worldwide transition to civilian careers. "Ready for the big announcement?" Major Rodriguez, now Colonel Rodriguez, asked, entering his office. She'd been with the program since those early days at Fort Carson, watching it grow from a simple idea into a global initiative. "Almost," Tom replied, adjusting his tie. He'd never quite gotten used to wearing suits instead of coveralls, but his role had evolved far beyond the hands-on mechanic he once was. Did James arrive safely? James Walker, now in his 80s but still sharp as ever, had insisted on being present for this announcement. He'd been flown in by military transport, his presence a testament to where this journey had begun. His grandson Richard, now the program's deputy director, had personally escorted him. The main auditorium was packed with dignitaries from around the world. Military leaders from NATO countries, Asian defense partners, and various international organizations filled the seats. But mixed among them were the people who mattered most to Tom, program graduates who'd gone on to remarkable success. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom began his address, "when I fixed a broken-down car one night years ago, I never imagined it would lead to this moment. Today we're not just celebrating success, we're expanding our mission to help veterans worldwide." The announcement detailed partnerships with military organizations in 20 countries. The program's curriculum had been translated into 12 languages, with more to come. Training centers modeled after the U.S. facility would be built in strategic locations around the globe. "But this isn't just about buildings and programs," Tom continued. "It's about understanding that veterans everywhere face similar challenges in transitioning to civilian life. And more importantly, they possess similar potential to succeed." James Walker was helped to the podium, his voice still carrying that quiet dignity Tom remembered from their first meeting. When my car broke down that night, I thought I was just getting help from a kind mechanic. Instead, I witnessed the birth of a movement that would change countless lives. The presentation included video messages from international veterans who'd already completed pilot programs in their countries, a former Royal Air Force technician who now ran a successful aviation maintenance company in Britain, a Korean military vehicle specialist who'd established a training center in Seoul. Each success story echoed the original program's principles. After the formal announcements, Tom led a tour of the latest additions to the training center. The facility had grown to include specialized workshops for emerging technologies, electric vehicles, autonomous systems, aerospace components. Each area represented new opportunities for veterans to apply their skills. The principles remain the same, Tom explained to the international delegation. We're not just teaching technical skills, we're building bridges between military expertise and civilian applications. Every country has its own needs, but the fundamental approach works universally. During the tour, a group of current students demonstrated the program's methodology. They smoothly switched between military and civilian terminology, explaining complex technical processes in ways anyone could understand. It was this ability to translate skills between worlds that had made the program so successful. Later that evening, at a private dinner for key stakeholders, Tom shared his vision for the future. This expansion isn't just about helping more veterans, he explained. It's about creating a global network of skilled professionals who understand both military and civilian needs. Imagine the possibilities for international cooperation and advancement. The dining hall was filled with success stories, program graduates who'd become industry leaders, instructors who'd trained hundreds of veterans, and military officials who'd supported the program's growth. Each person represented a link in a chain of positive change that stretched back to that one night of kindness. James Walker, sitting at the head table with Tom, raised his glass in a toast. "To think," he said, his eyes twinkling, "all this started because you couldn't ignore a broken-down car. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the power to change the world." As the evening wound down, Tom found himself back in his office, looking at the framed business card that had started it all. Beside it now stood international agreements, partnership documents, and plans for training centers on 4 continents. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Martinez, one of his first students, now overseeing the program's expansion in Europe. "Just signed the agreement for the London facility. Your simple act of kindness has gone global, Tom." Looking out at the campus lights twinkling in the darkness, Tom reflected on the journey. From a small auto repair shop to an international program changing lives across the globe. But at its heart, the mission remained the same, helping others find their path, just as he'd done that night years ago. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, coordinating international programs, adapting to different cultures, maintaining the program's core values across borders. But tonight, Tom Miller, the mechanic who couldn't ignore a stranger in need, knew that kindness truly had the power to change the world, one life at a time. The story comes full circle in its final chapter, 10 years after that fateful night when Tom Miller decided to help a stranded veteran. On a cool autumn evening, much like the one when this journey began, Tom stood in front of his old auto repair shop. The building had been renovated, transformed into the first satellite campus of the National Veterans Technical Training Center's youth program. "Feels different being back here, doesn't it?" James Walker's grandson Richard said, standing beside Tom. The younger man had followed in his grandfather's footsteps, becoming a key figure in the program's leadership. Hard to believe it all started right here. Today marked a special occasion, the dedication of the James Walker Memorial Training Center. The elderly veteran had passed away peacefully 6 months ago, but his legacy lived on in the thousands of lives transformed by the program he'd helped inspire. The small shop where Tom had once fixed his car would now become a place where veterans would mentor young people interested in technical careers. "Your grandfather would have loved this," Tom said, watching as people began to arrive for the ceremony. The parking lot, where he'd once helped James with his broken-down car, was now filled with guests from around the world, program graduates, military officials, and community leaders. Inside, the shop had been completely redesigned. Modern equipment stood alongside deliberately preserved elements of the original building. Tom's old workbench remained in place, now displaying photographs documenting the program's journey from humble beginnings to global impact. Colonel Rodriguez, who'd been there almost from the start, approached with the latest statistics. "We've just crossed 100,000 graduates worldwide," she reported. "The employment rate holds steady at 98%, and our graduates have created over 200,000 additional jobs. But numbers alone couldn't capture the program's true impact." As Tom prepared to address the gathered crowd, he saw countless familiar faces, each representing a story of transformation. Sarah Martinez, his first student, now ran the European division. Mike Thompson had established similar programs in Asia. James Chen had just returned from setting up a new center in Australia. 10 years ago, Tom began his speech, a car broke down in this very spot. I was tired, ready to go home, but something made me stay and help. That decision changed not just my life, but countless others. He gestured to the renovated facility. This building represents more than just a training center. It represents the power of simple kindness to create extraordinary change. The ceremony included video messages from program graduates across the globe. Each shared how their lives had been transformed, and more importantly, how they were now helping others. The ripple effect of that one act of kindness had become a wave of positive change washing across continents. A special moment came when Richard Walker unveiled a bronze plaque bearing his grandfather's words. "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the power to change the world." Below it, a smaller inscription read, "In memory of James Walker, whose broken-down car started a movement." After the formal ceremony, Tom led small groups through the facility. The old repair bays had been converted into state-of-the-art training stations. Each incorporated both civilian and military equipment, representing the bridge between worlds that had made the program so successful. "This is where it really comes full circle," Tom explained, showing visitors the youth mentorship area. "Our veterans aren't just learning new skills, they're passing their knowledge on to the next generation. Every young person who learns here carries forward the legacy of service and kindness." As evening fell, Tom found himself alone in what had once been his office. The space now housed a small museum documenting the program's history. His old toolbox sat in a place of honor, alongside James Walker's military medals and photographs of key moments in the program's development. His phone buzzed with a message from the Pentagon, confirmation of funding for another 100 training centers worldwide. What had started as a simple act of kindness had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. Looking out at the gathering dusk, Tom remembered that night 10 years ago. He'd been tired, ready to go home, but something had made him stop to help a stranded veteran. That decision had set in motion a chain of events that transformed thousands of lives. As he prepared to leave, a young apprentice mechanic, the daughter of one of his first students, asked him for advice. "Mr. Miller, how do you build something this big? Where do you even start?" Tom smiled, remembering James Walker's words from so long ago. "You start with kindness," he told her. "Everything else grows from there." Walking to his car, Tom paused to look back at the building one last time. The lights inside glowed warmly, promising new beginnings for those who would learn there. The old shop sign had been preserved, mounted below the new center's name. A reminder that great achievements often have humble beginnings. In the end, Tom realized, success isn't measured in buildings or programs or numbers. It's measured in lives changed, in kindness passed forward, in the countless small moments that add up to transform the world. As he drove away from his old shop, now reborn as a place of new beginnings, he knew that the greatest journeys often start with the smallest steps, and the greatest changes often begin with a simple act of kindness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.